The Atlanta Braves have one of the best rosters in all of baseball, and I brought on an expert to talk about it. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Friday, January 10th, your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsey Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and Instagram as well. And as always, you can find my written work, bravestoday.com, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And special guest today, who is also familiar with having both a podcast and a newsletter. We're joined by Chris Towers of CBS Sports, host of Fantasy Baseball Today, which, by the way, nominated for Best Baseball Podcast. Go to sportspodcastgroup.com and place your vote for him. Also, the author of the Fantasy Baseball Today newsletter, which comes out every single morning. Incredible resource, in season, out of season, both. Chris, thanks for coming on the show, and thanks for giving us a few minutes of your time.
Thanks for all the very kind words. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that inspired me to reach out to you and have you on to talk to Braves fans here in Braves country is there was a lot of consternation about Atlanta's offseason, right? They haven't done a lot of major league deals, haven't brought pieces in, but they've seen guys leave. Max Fried, Charlie Morton, Travis d'Arnaud, and things like that. You put out your fantasy baseball rankings, I think earlier this week, and quite a few Braves are pretty high up in the rankings. So I wanted to give you a chance to kind of talk about how good this team is, how good this roster is, and maybe how you feel as an outside source about this team coming up. Starting in the infield, 3 of the 4 traditional infield spots, you have Atlanta as having a top 4 player in fantasy at that position. Matt Olson 4th, Ozzie Albies 4th, and Austin Riley 3rd. And all those guys, for different reasons, injuries and effectiveness, struggled a bit last year to kind of recreate their career performance. Who do you trust from that trio to kind of bounce back and have the traditional season we're used to seeing from those guys?
I think Riley is the easiest answer there, just because Olson and Albies, their careers have been defined by inconsistency. I think it's fair to say. In Albies' case, the bad seasons have tended to be when he's also dealt with injuries. So I think you can explain some of that away. But Olson, it's just like a random number generator, right? It's like a 990 OPS or an 800 OPS. And it's like never anything in between. He's either one of the 5 best power hitters in baseball or just like a normal run-of-the-mill 30 home run guy. It's really weird. There doesn't seem to be I think he's just an inherently high variance player. And Albies might be as well, because he's a power hitter who doesn't have a lot of power, especially from the left side of the plate where he gets most of his plate appearances. He's kind of a fairly run-of-the-mill hitter as a lefty, and then he is really good from the right side of the plate to make up for it, gets most of his power there. I think it's like a 900 OPS for his career from the right side of the plate, and like a 730 from the left side or something. I think he might be more prone to fluctuations in just like the juiced ball, like whether the ball travels 3% further one year or the next might be the difference between 30 homer Ozzie Albies, which we've seen. I think his career has 33
and 23. Yeah.
Or like the 24 homer version of Ozzie Albies. And he's the same guy. It's just like the ball changes, or it's more humid one year. And he seems to have a very slim margin for error in a way that Olson also does, because his plate discipline is iffy sometimes. He's got fairly big holes in his swing, but those are really good players still. But Riley, I know he's coming off a disappointing year. I know 2024 wasn't what you hoped it would be, but really it was about a bad month and a half at the start of the season. And then he got hurt at the end. And between that, he was Austin Riley. Once he got going in like mid-May, it was like I can't remember the exact date. I can look it up, but it was like from the point when he figured it out, he was on like a 38 homer pace. He had the 907 OPS. It was what you expect Austin Riley to be. And then of course his season ends early with a hand injury, and the final numbers don't quite get to where they needed to be. But I don't really look at at Austin Riley as someone that I'm concerned about at all. It was mid-June when he started to figure things out. So the first 50 or so games were pretty bad, but he had that stretch starting on June 14th where he homered 3 straight games. From that point on, he was just Austin Riley. And it was frustrating the first 2.5 months. It was longer than I thought, but he also had that, I'm sure you guys remember, that weird oblique injury in May where he missed, 12, 15 days, and they just never put him on the IL.
He was on the bench the entire time. Yeah, it was
so stupid.
Atlanta's had really odd injury management at times last season.
Yeah.
You'd see where they'd sit a guy for a week hoping to avoid the 10-day IL, and it would end up dragging on past that when you can only post date a certain number of days, and you need to be aggressive at doing the post dating and bringing somebody else in. But in Atlanta's situation, I think unlike a lot of teams, they don't have another starting caliber guy behind him who was platooning with him because everybody plays every day. And I think that's one of the inherent weaknesses we've kind of talked about on the show about this roster is you don't have a ton of that depth because your guys play every single day. But definitely something where like you can see how the season has an explanation for Austin Riley, why it was so bad compared to some of the others. And side note, do you think that there's a chance that we see Austin Riley take that kind of last leap into perennial, not just MVP finisher, right? Like I think he has 3 top 7 finishes, but a guy who can be in the top 3. Do you think that there's a chance as he gets into his late 20s, we could see that? Because I know for fantasy, if you can get him in, I don't know, the 3rd round, and he can make a leap like that, that can win you a league.
Yeah, and I think he's one of the better values in fantasy this year. Because this is a guy who was probably the 15th to 17th pick in most drafts last year. Now his ADP is 31.6. He has fallen in a way that like none of the skills indicators say that Austin Riley was a worse version of himself last year. He hit the ball harder than ever, actually. His average exit velocity was higher than it's ever been. His strikeout rate right in line with what it's been the previous 3 years. He is in what we consider a player's prime. 27 to 29 is when we historically think that players are going to peak. So another minor step forward, whether it's something we've seen with Braves players over the past couple of years where he all of a sudden the plate discipline just gets a little bit better and he cuts the strikeout rate from 25%. If he has one of those 21%, 20% strikeout rate seasons and hits 310 with 35 homers, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I think he's that caliber of hitter, but he's also, this is something that I think we struggle with as fantasy players, as fantasy analysts, as baseball fans, is when you have a player who's consistent. And Austin Riley from 2021 to 2023 was just a metronome, like 33, 38, 37 homers, batting average. There was the 1 year that was super high, but the skill set has been very, very stable in that regard. And so I think we tend to think of guys like that as not having upside, but variance happens to all players. Like you have even guys who are relatively stable will have career years. You look at every player, basically, even Hall of Fame players who were very, very good have those career years. So I think Austin Riley, the thing you like about him as a fantasy option is I feel very confident knowing I'm going to get 30 homers and a bunch of runs and a bunch of RBI from him with a batting average that will probably help me. It certainly won't hurt me. I do think like the raw power for a career year where he hits 40 plus or a year where he hits 310, the skills are absolutely there. It's just he needs one of those years where everything goes right, kind of like Matt Olson in 2023, where it happens sometimes where just for 1 year, none of the bad regression stuff happens and everything good happens. And I can absolutely see Austin Riley being a top 5 hitter in baseball in any given season. Yeah, I think that's within the range of outcomes.
Yeah, and I think Braves fans sometimes lose track of the caliber that some of this lineup already is.
Yeah,
and in the outfield, you kind of have a similar situation there. You had Michael Harris II as the 14th best outfielder in baseball, which for a center fielder I think is very good because obviously the extra physical demands of playing center field. And then Ronald Acuña Jr. at 10th. And I think that was one that a lot of people expressed some surprise in because there's a little bit of doubt. We've seen in ADP and early drafts and things like that, that Ronald's starting to slip back a little bit in these drafts. But I think you said on the podcast the other day, you feel pretty confident that Ronald's going to be back by May 1st or so. And the extra time that he has to recover from the surgery, from the knee repair, he'll probably be closer to his normal self than what he was in 2022.
The timeline here is so interesting because we have seen Ronald Acuña recover from a torn ACL, and the torn ACL, I think, was in 2021. It happened in like late July, if I'm remembering correctly.
Later in the year.
And he was back by the end of April. And then this year, his injury happens, I believe, in early June. And Mark Bowman of MLB.com, I saw recently, said that there's a chance he misses like most of the first third of the season, which that wouldn't, like, that's within the timetable for a torn ACL recovery. And maybe because it's the second time and because he didn't come back quite at full strength last time, maybe they'll be a little more cautious with it. You usually see a lot of guys come back from torn ACLs in about 9 months. And while 9 to 12 is typically the timetable, you don't see the 12-month happen very often, even in football. I used to write about fantasy football, and we would assume if a guy tore his ACL in November, he'd just be back by the start of the next season, about 9 months later. And it's January 9th as we're recording this. And I think part of the problem with talking about Ronald Acuña is by the time the season starts, by the time most fantasy players are drafting, we will have a much better idea of where Ronald Acuña is, to the point where if he's playing in spring training games, I really wouldn't be shocked. It would line up with an expected timetable for a torn ACL. So I am trying to split the difference right now between, hey, Ronald Acuña could be back on opening day. It doesn't sound like that's going to happen, to be clear. Everything the Braves have said sounds like they do not expect that. Or, hey, he might not be back until mid-May. I'm trying to split the difference right now between those two things, just because nobody's really drafting right now. There's some drafts going on. They're mostly like high stakes fantasy leagues where you set your lineup on opening day and you never change it. The
best ball, things like that. Yeah.
So there's a lot more like injury uncertainty that people try to avoid in those situations, just because you don't have a waiver wire. And the Braves, I feel, are sending some conflicting signals here, right? Because Alex Anthopoulos said he doesn't expect him for opening day. Okay, take him at his word. Then you look at the offseason and what they've done, and more specifically, what they haven't done. They traded Jorge Soler. They added Brian De La Cruz on, I don't even think, a full major league deal.
It's a non-guaranteed. He has a 40-man roster spot, but he's only guaranteed if he makes the opening day roster. They've done that a lot this offseason.
I don't know. Eli White doesn't seem like a real plan B either. I understand that they are publicly saying we don't expect Ronald Acuña to come back on opening day. Does that mean they don't expect Ronald Acuña until May? Or does that mean they don't expect Ronald Acuña until March 28th? Opening day is the 27th. You look at the roster, and either, and I think this is the frustration of Braves fans, the roster right now looks like either we're kind of punting and saying we're just going to hold steady this year, and if we make the playoffs with Ronald Acuña and Spencer Strider coming back, that's great. If we don't, I think they're definitely going to make the playoffs, by the way. I think it would be stunning if they didn't. But or they're much more optimistic about Strider and Acuña's chances of being impact players this year than they're publicly saying. I think you can look at it both ways, but either way, I think this roster is good enough to make the playoffs as is. And when Ronald Acuña gets back, you hope he's better than the 2022 version, who couldn't elevate the ball, didn't really hit for power, was just overall pretty disappointing coming back from the torn ACL. Even if he's just that, I'm pretty sure he was still like a 5-win player. Like, that's how good Ronald Acuña is.
He was still really good even in that situation. Yeah, that's kind of, I think, what we're banking on here. And it really means, I don't want to take too long on this first segment because we have a couple more to go, but it really means that there's not a ton of weaknesses on this roster. If you operate on the assumption, which you mentioned, which Atlanta's trying to hedge their bets on the statements that they make to not set up improper expectations for Ronald, but that he's back somewhat early, then your only outfield hole is left field. And that's something where Brian De La Cruz, Jared Kelenic can platoon. You got shortstop with Orlando Arcia. We've talked a ton on the show about how bad his 2024 was at the plate. And then Sean Murphy, where you can see an avenue for him to rebound with more playing time, what he's had in his career. Are you legitimately worried about any of those spots, or does it all kind of make sense for the bottom 3 spots in your lineup, or those 3, and they'll be fine if the rest of the lineup is doing what they can do?
Yeah, so I'm a Marlins fan, and there was a point where Brian De La Cruz was the Marlins' like second best hitter. And if that's the situation you find yourself in, you've got a bad lineup, and the Marlins have had pretty bad lineups. If he's the 7th best player on your lineup or your 8th, it's totally fine. I think the bottom third of the lineup looks like a relative weakness right now. And I think the one thing you have to keep in mind with the Braves is maybe 2023 was one of those years where everything went right. Like nobody had a down year in 2023. And then in 2024, I kind of feel like everybody had a down year in the lineup.
Marcell Ozuna.
Yeah, it was one of those years where everything went wrong. And there maybe aren't as good as the 104 win team that they were in 2023, because look, no team is as good as a 104 win team every year. Maybe the Dodgers, I don't know, but besides
started to wonder that one, yeah.
They're probably better, especially offensively, than they were last year. And Sean Murphy is a guy that I really do believe will have a much better 2025 than his 2024, because he was 28 in 2023, had this amazing first half. I think he made the All-Star team, right?
He did.
And then just wore down. And he talked about it. He went from playing in Oakland, like perfect weather all year round, to playing in the summer in Atlanta. And he said that just caught up to him, the humidity, the heat. Last year, oblique injuries are among the like non-surgical injuries, arguably the toughest for baseball players to come back from. They frequently have setbacks. They frequently take longer than you think. They frequently just limit you, because baseball's all rotation, and obliques are a really big issue in baseball. And he suffered an oblique injury on opening day. So
like 6 innings into his season.
Yeah. So I just think Sean Murphy was probably never 100% last year, and that stuff matters. So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he's going to have a bounce back season. Arcia, I think the Braves will be trading for a shortstop before the trade deadline next year. If I'll give Scott White this one, he's our resident Braves fan on the Fantasy Baseball Today podcast. And he has been on the Bo Bichette to the Braves train for a while. I think that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If they wanted to spend some money, a Dansby Swanson reunion would make some sense. If they wanted to shore up that position and go back there, I don't know how Braves fans would feel about that one, but I would be surprised if Orlando Arcia was the shortstop for the Braves on August 1st.
We're definitely going to be unpacking that in a full show later in the offseason about what would the options be if you get into 3 months into the year and you realize you have to make a change.
Yeah.
In just a second, let's talk about the pitching staff and some of the expectations and projections for them. We'll do that next right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsey Crosby joined by Chris Towers of CBS Sports. You can find all of his stuff. He's on Twitter and Blue Sky at CP Towers. You can also find Fantasy Baseball Today, the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, and the newsletter. You can sign up at cbssports.com. And while you're on the internet, sportspodcastgroup.com, go vote for Fantasy Baseball Today as the top baseball podcast. There's a lot of other NL East podcasts in that
vote. Consider Fantasy Baseball Today a vote for the Braves.
There you go, because there's 2 Nationals pods, there's 2 Mets pods, and David Sampson, formerly of the Marlins, has a pod in there. So a vote for Fantasy Baseball Today is a vote for the Braves. Okay, so in the rankings too, on the pitching staff, you have 4 Brave starters in the top 50. And I don't think anybody's going to be surprised by these names. Chris Sale at 6, Spencer Schwellenbach at 35th. I've been really high on this show about him as a number 2 as soon as this season. Ronaldo Lopez at 45. And then Spencer Strider's at 32. And I think that's the big X factor for this Braves rotation, because we've covered in length in this show. Atlanta's used between 10 to 13 starters just about every season in the last 4. And you have plenty of depth this year, but there's a question about outside of the big 3, who would be a playoff starter for the Braves were you to get there. And by that ranking of Strider in the 32nd, it feels like you feel pretty confident Spencer Strider is going to be able to come back as close to the normal version of what Spencer Strider is when he makes his eventual debut.
This is a really tough one, though, because if he had just had Tommy John surgery, it would be both more and less uncertain, right? Because it would be more uncertain because the timeline would be way wider, right? Like we might not see, if Spencer Strider had full Tommy John surgery, I think you wouldn't expect to see him until June at the earliest. But because he had the internal brace, because it wasn't a full UCL tear, there's a pretty good chance it's going to be a 12 to 13 month timetable rather than 14 to 16 like often happens. But there is just very little track record of the internal brace procedure for pitchers. And it's really, for a baseball nerd who is interested in this kind of stuff, it's kind of exciting because both Spencer Strider and Shohei Ohtani are coming back from Ohtani. Everything around Ohtani and the media is weird. And so they have not actually said what kind of surgery he had. They've been really cagey about it, but it's pretty clear it was some version of the internal brace rather than a full Tommy John surgery. Mm-hmm. And this is a relatively new procedure that we just don't have a lot of data for to say. We've seen hitters come back from it. I think the results there are mixed as well, but I don't know how much of that. Like Trevor Story has struggled. I don't know if that's because of the internal brace, but we don't have a ton of examples of pitchers coming back from it, especially starting pitchers who average 98 miles per hour with their fastball. So I am extremely hopeful that Spencer Strider can come back and be more or less who he was. And I think part of that is, if you go back to when he had the surgery, it ended up being a much less severe injury than they initially feared. If I'm remembering correctly, there was UCL damage because of bone spurs. Mm-hmm. And that was what they saw on the MRIs that made them think it was a full tear. Turns out it was a partial tear. He didn't need the full reconstruction. I'm hopeful that because of that, he can come back and be himself relatively soon. There will be an adjustment period to be sure, and maybe he doesn't go all the way right away, but this was the best pitcher in baseball when he was at his best. So if he's 90% the best pitcher in baseball, you're still talking about
a really good guy.
You're still talking about a guy who could strike out 250 over the course of a full season rather than 280 or 290. Maybe he takes a step back there, but should be the best pitcher in this rotation, I think, even if Chris Sale stays healthy. The problem is, you look at the rotation, and it's Chris Sale who stayed healthy last year, and I think his injury issues have been overstated in a lot of ways. I know he has had trouble staying healthy, but one of the injuries, I think he fell off his bike and broke his wrist. He had the rib injury, which you wouldn't think would happen again for a pitcher. He also had Tommy John surgery in his 30s, so that's a concern. But a lot of the injuries felt pretty fluky, and that there was a reason why a lot of people were in on Chris Sale for fantasy last year. There's a lot more concern about drafting him now that he's the 5th or 6th pitcher off the board. That's where it's okay.
Yeah, at
now
that
we're drafting
price,
at the ceiling. Yeah.
But
I still think he's awesome. I'm a big fan of Spencer Schwellenbach. We talked a lot about him at the end of last season and what he was doing. If he had qualified, he would have been top 12 in both swinging strike rate and K- walk ratio. He's got a 6-pitch arsenal with multiple really good swing and miss pitches, including the splitter. There is a lack of track record with Spencer Schwellenbach, for sure. Braves fans will know this. He didn't pitch in college, right?
He was a closer in his
reliever
final season. Okay. Yeah. He was almost entirely a shortstop in most of college.
They moved him to the rotation, had a huge innings jump last year. We're not sure how he's going to react to that. That's always a question. But the skills, like you said, number 2, I think absolutely could be one of the 25 best pitchers in baseball, in fantasy. And then I I have some concerns about Reynaldo Lopez, how sustainable what he did last year was. The fact that he came back from, I think, forearm and elbow injuries at separate points in the second half and was better, or maybe forearm and shoulder
inflammation. Yeah.
And has had a lot of injuries in his past. This was really the first year he's ever been a good starter, but he was better after coming back from his injuries towards the end of last season, which was pretty stunning to me because I thought, okay, things are going to fall apart now, and they just never did. So
yeah,
it could be a really good rotation. It's just when you look at it, and Grant Holmes at SP4 on opening day, Ian Anderson SP5, or whoever it ends up being, and then you start to look at it and you think there's some depth. AJ Smith-Shawver is talented. Hurston Waldrop, I don't really think there's much beyond those guys, but hey, if Strider comes back and he's fine, you've got 8 guys.
Yeah.
It's just, it feels like a rotation that I would like a lot more with one more guy. Not a star, not even, I'm not saying Charlie Morton, but just another guy that you would, a little more depth, because it feels like a rotation that if everything goes right, could be really good. But you also look at Sale, Lopez, Schwellenbach, and Strider. It's not hard to see how things go wrong for any of those 4.
Yeah. And even some of the depth options, Ian Anderson coming back from Tommy John, what's his workload capacity? AJ Smith-Shawver, Hurston Waldrop were both hurt and missed chunks of the year last year. Workload and innings, it really feels, and I think we've made this case on the pod, that one more starter would do this team a ton of security. And it's really more important. It's a guy that has a history of workload more so than it is a guy who can give you an ERA of 3. You need to worry about a guy who can make 25 or 30 starts for you. That's
like a Martin Perez, who I know just signed with the White Sox. That is a really uninspiring, unsexy name, but he's a guy that you can put in your rotation. He can be a swing man if you need him to, but he can be there. That's the thing that I feel
he's gonna take the ball.
Yeah, that's the biggest question with the Braves is it's the big 4 guys, especially. Just there are a significant number of red flags across the 4 of them, not evenly distributed necessarily, but it's one of those things. As a Marlins fan, there's been a lot of talk the last couple of years about the Marlins have so much rotation depth, and the envy of the league. And last spring, people were going, you can go 8 deep on the Marlins with above average starters, and
they all got hurt.
Yeah, Vicente Balazzo, I think, led the team in starts or something last year. Guys that you've never heard of were starting every day by the end of the season, and that's what happens with pitching. Everything doesn't go right with pitching. Everything doesn't go right with anything in life. Things will go wrong. But pitching especially you cannot expect things to go right. You have to plan for when things go wrong because they inevitably will.
Yeah. A point that we made on the pod last week is, and just about every season in the last 4, you've lost a starting pitcher for the season, right? Whether it was Kyle Wright, whether it was Strider last year, it was Max Fried for over 2 months, had 3 IL stints in 2023. It's like something's going to happen, and that's where your depth comes in. And it feels like your lineup, you've added a lot of options for hitters and the high minors and things like that. But your rotation, you're kind of banking on everybody being healthy. And one more ad wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. In just a second, I want to get your thoughts on the rest of the division, the Marlins, and then also Mets, Phillies, Nats. We'll do that next right here on Braves Today. Final segment of Braves Today. Lindsey Crosby joined by Chris Towers of CBS Sports. Reminder, sportspodcastgroup.com. Click on Vote Now. Fantasy Baseball Today is in the running for Best Baseball Podcast. A vote for Fantasy Baseball Today is a vote for the Braves. Okay, so I want to start with the juggernaut in the division. If we look at the National League East, your Miami Marlins.
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel about what's going to happen this season? What kind of hopes do you have that Miami's trades that they've made in the last years have brought in enough talent to get this team back into competing in what looks to be one of the hardest divisions in baseball?
I think the Marlins are going to finish 5th. I don't think I'm telling any tales out of school there. I don't think anybody's really going to disagree with me. It's not that the Marlins don't have talent, but even with all the trades that they've made, I think they've brought in a lot of likely quad A players. And I like Davison De Los Santos and Connor Norby and Kyle Stowers. I think there are talents there, but it's kind of a situation where if you get 2-3 win players out of all the guys that they traded for a year ago or within the last year, I guess, that's probably a win. And so I don't know, maybe Sandy Alcantara comes back and he's just shoving for 7 innings every time coming back from Tommy John surgery and he can carry them. And Yuri Perez comes back in June and
Ryan Weathers lost like 35 pounds. He said he's in great shape now.
Was really good last year at the end. Maybe Edward Cabrera can throw strike. Like you can see how in 2023 things went right enough for them to make the playoffs, but no, this is the worst team in the division, probably the worst team in baseball or the worst team in the NL, I guess, although the Rockies are always tough to beat there. And I think that's by design. The Marlins do not think that they are a contender, and that's fine by me because they're not a contender. It's okay. We can move on now.
We can move on. Okay, great. Okay. I think a lot of Braves fans have been worried the last few seasons about the Phillies. And obviously UC went to the World Series, went to the NLCS, won the division last year. Phillies kind of just running it back this year. They added, they made a trade for Jesus Luzardo. They added Max Kepler. But for the most part, this is just the same core. If all things are equal, all teams are healthy, does Atlanta have a chance of getting past Philly and winning the division, or is this still Philly's division to win until spoken otherwise?
I think the Braves, Phillies, and Mets are all pretty similar. There are superstars on all three of those teams. The Phillies and Braves, especially, really top heavy with star level players. The Phillies, I do think, have the best rotation in the division, while being backed up by a very strong offense. And so I do think it's hard to beat that combination, right? Like you look at the rotation and Wheeler, Christopher Sanchez, Aaron Nola, Ranger Suarez, Jesus Luzardo as a number 5 pitcher, Taijuan Walker. I know he was terrible last year, but that is your number 6 or a swing guy. Andrew Painter, arguably the best pitching prospect in baseball. Andrew Painter should be up sometime this season and could blow people away. He was about to make the rotation as a 19-year-old 2 years ago before having Tommy John surgery. So
they screwed up by waiting until the summer to actually do the surgery. The rehab never works, it feels like.
There was a period where the Angels tried to do that with every guy who got hurt, and it never worked out. And you're probably better off just doing the surgery, especially with a 19-year-old. Like Andrew Painter, I think, is 21 right now. He lost 2 seasons and he's 21 years old. So I think they probably should.
He's like AJ Smith-Shawver. He's so incredibly young. He'd just become out of college now if he wasn't, but he's instead a major leaguer.
Yeah. And that, I think the Phillies are going to be tough to beat, but any one of those 3 teams winning the division would not surprise me. It's just the Phillies do seem to have the best rotation and the most depth, especially on the pitching side. The hitting side is, Harper, Schwarber, Turner gets hurt. I don't know how much I like that offense. They're all old as well. Pretty much all of the main guys in that lineup are 31 or older. So you can see things going wrong for the Phillies, but I think they have enough contingencies that they're clearly one of the favorites, if not the outright favorite.
Yeah. And when it comes to the Mets, a lot of Braves fans, obviously adding Juan Soto is huge, makes any team better. But a lot of Braves fans aren't convinced that the rotation has done enough to contend for the division next year. You brought back Sean Manaea. Kodai Senga should be back from the injury. The only innings he got last year were against Atlanta. Of course, he did really well in that game.
That was so frustrating.
That's how things worked for the Braves last year.
He looked awesome and then popped his calf.
Yeah,
like chasing a foul ball or something. It was dreadful.
Fielded a bunt, something like an infield grounder, fielded his position. Yeah. But like you look at Frankie Montas as their number 3, David Peterson trying to convert Clay Holmes to starting like what we did with Ronaldo Lopez. How worried should Braves fans be that the Mets are actually a better roster than they were last year, both potentially pitching wise, definitely lineup wise? How worried should Braves fans be about the Mets?
I don't know if the Mets are quite there. Look, anytime you have 2 MVP caliber players at the top of the lineup in Francisco Lindor and Juan Soto, like that's going to compete. And Mark Vientos reminds me a lot of Austin Riley, actually. Like the first taste of the majors, he was a little overwhelmed, whiffed way too much. took a big step forward with his plate discipline last year. And if that sticks, I think he could be like an Austin Riley type player, a guy who hits 30 homers every year and doesn't kill you in batting average. And after that, the lineup's not great, though. Brandon Nimmo's very good. Starling Marte, who knows what you can get out of him. Jeff McNeil. I'm
Brett Beatty at third, maybe. If
Jose Siri, Francisco Alvarez, I've kind of soured on over the last year, just didn't take the step forward. And the Mets are an interesting organization in that I have a lot of confidence in their ability to get the most out of pitchers. They've developed a couple of really nice young pitchers. I know Christian Scott got hurt last year, but Brandon Sproat had an awesome year in the minors.
Can we talk about just sorry, pet peeve of mine real quick? Those are both former University of Florida guys, because University of Florida cannot seem to develop pitching to save their life. And all of those guys get better when they leave Florida.
And the SEC's tough. I get it, but put some resources into it and get some pitching dev guys. Like, hopefully they've got like the TrackMan and stuff like that to try to develop these guys. But yeah, it does seem like the UF guys take big steps forward when they get
their
to the
pitch mixes.
pros. Yeah.
They do so many different things and they're so much better. And most college guys can't project that much growth, but Florida guys can. It's just a frustrating thing.
And the Mets, on that note, seem to be doing really like the Shamanaya signing last year. He's always been a guy who like has a good month followed by 2 bad months. And last year they identified something in his pitch mix, something in the movement of his pitches. He lowered his arm slot and was just Chris Sale for 2 months. And I say that because he talked about imitating Chris Sale's delivery and his release point, and made his sweeper way better, his fastball played up. How sustainable that is for a 32-year-old is a question, but like David Peterson has had really good stretches. Luis Severino, they got a lot out of last year. When they signed Frankie Montas, this is one thing that I think a lot of smart baseball analysts, the ones working in the public sphere have identified is 10 years ago, the dumb teams were using ERA and the smart teams were using FIP and whatever their proprietary version of defense independent pitching stats were.
Yeah.
And now maybe the dumb teams are using a proprietary defense independent pitching stat, and the Rockies are probably still using ERA, and the smart teams are looking at pitch characteristics and trying to see, okay, this guy like Frankie Montas wasn't great last year. He had a very good run with the Brewers once he got there, but overall pretty middling guy. And what I guarantee what the Mets saw with him is when he was good with the A's, his arm slot was way up. And ever since he's dealt with shoulder injuries since that year with the Yankees, his arm slot has gotten lower and lower. And that's what you see a lot with shoulder injuries in particular, is guys lower their arm slot. If Frankie Montas is healthy, I guarantee what the Mets have spent all offseason telling him is raise that arm slot. You are a north-south pitcher, fastballs up, splitters down. If he can stay healthy and execute, I think Frankie Montas can be pretty good. And so I'm willing to give the Mets under David Stearns some benefit of the doubt when it comes to maximizing the pitching. Like the names that they have, Shamanaya, Kodai Senga, Frankie Montas, David Peterson, Clay Holmes, I really don't believe in the move to the rotation, but
odd to me.
Maybe like a sinker sweeper doesn't really seem like a starting caliber combination for a pitcher, but maybe they're certainly smarter than me. So I'll give them some benefit of the doubt there. I really like Brandon Sproat. I know he struggled at AAA last year, but I think he'll make an impact at some point this year. The names aren't great. I would be surprised if the Mets didn't at least have an average starting rotation. The bullpen, again, the names aren't great besides Edwin Diaz, but I think it'll probably be fine. And so I would probably pick the Mets to finish third in the division still. But with the Braves, I think being a fairly high variance team, and the Phillies relying so much on guys in their close to their mid-30s now, you can see ways that things go wrong and the Mets win the division, but I would pick them third, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty reasonable take to have there. Is you can see the issues for each team, and all three teams have vulnerabilities, but there's also paths for all three teams to win this division. And it's really going to come down to, can you win your games on the field? So I think that's at the end of the day, it all comes down to, hey, you got to go out and play ball and win. And that's ultimately what we just can't wait to happen. It'll be a couple, obviously a few more weeks until pitchers and catchers report, just over a month. Around Valentine's Day is typically when that'll happen. In the meantime, folks are going to be doing preparing for their fantasy drafts, all their stuff. Where can they go to get more of your content, your information, and your analysis of fantasy baseball?
Yes, cbssports.com/fantasy. If you want to just go straight to the fantasy site, we're launching pretty much everything. We've been working all off season, but next week, all of our full rankings, salary cap / auction values, sleepers, breakouts, busts, everything will be on the site. cbssports.com/fantasy next week. cbssports.com/newsletters for the Fantasy Baseball Today newsletter. It's free. It'll be probably 3 times a week over the next month or so. But by the time spring training starts, it'll probably be every day. And it'll be every day in your inbox every morning from then until October. So it's a lot of work. I probably write too much, but you know what? It's free. You will get your money's worth at the very least from the Fantasy Baseball Today newsletter.
I can confirm it is definitely worth the money. It's one of those morning reads for me every single day while I'm drinking coffee at the school, at the bus stop, waiting with the kids. And again, reminder, sportspodcastgroup.com, click on vote now, vote for Fantasy Baseball Today as the best baseball podcast. Do it for the Atlanta Braves. Barring some sort of amazing signing, trade, something like that, we're back on Monday. Until next time, this has been Braves Today.